I had been dreading my birthday for weeks, but nothing could have prepared me for what I'd find behind that half-open door. What started as a night of celebration quickly spiraled into a nightmare, and by the end of it, my entire life was shattered. 25 years of marriage, destroyed in an instant. This is the story of the worst day of my life. The day I realized I didn't know my wife at all. Keep watching. I had been dreading my birthday for weeks. 47 didn't feel like much of a milestone, but Sarah, my wife of 25 years, seemed intent on making this one special. She'd been dropping hints left and right, teasing me about a surprise she had in store. "You'll never forget it," she'd say with a sly smile, one that used to make me feel warm inside, but lately just made me uneasy. It wasn't that our marriage was bad, not exactly. It was just stale. We barely talked anymore except about the mundane details of life. Groceries, bills, or who would take out the trash. I figured this was normal after so many years together. We weren't fighting, but we weren't connecting either. Ben, our 20-year-old son, came home from college that weekend. He brought some friends with him, Zach, Mike, and Tyler, all boys I'd seen around the house before. They were polite enough, I guess, but there was something about Zach that always rubbed me the wrong way. Too cocky, too sure of himself. The way he looked at people, like he already knew what you were going to say before you said it, grated on me. The house was buzzing with activity that morning as we all got ready for the evening's party. Sarah flitted from room to room, giving instructions to Ben and his friends, smiling that same sly smile every time our eyes met. I tried to brush it off, reminding myself that I was probably overthinking things. It was just a party after all. But as I watched Sarah interact with Zach, laughing a little too easily at his jokes, leaning in a little too close, something inside me twisted. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but a knot of unease had already formed in my gut. Still, I let it go. It was my birthday, and I didn't want to ruin the mood. That evening, guests started arriving, filling the house with laughter and the smell of barbecue. Sarah looked radiant as always, moving through the crowd with ease, making everyone feel at home. I tried to relax, tried to enjoy myself, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling that had been building all day. As the night wore on, I noticed Zach hanging around Sarah more and more. Every time I turned around, there he was, talking to her, standing too close, smiling that same smug smile. And every time I saw them together, my stomach tightened a little more. Eventually, Sarah and Zach disappeared from the living room, along with a couple of Ben's other friends. I watched them head toward the back of the house, towards the upstairs hallway. Something wasn't right. My gut told me to follow them, but I hesitated. What could they possibly be up to? It was my birthday after all. Maybe this was part of the surprise Sarah had been teasing me about. But the unease gnawed at me, refusing to let go. I stood there for a moment longer, staring after them, my heart pounding in my chest. I finally made up my mind and started walking. As I walked down the hallway, the noise from the party began to fade. Each step away from the laughter and music made my pulse quicken, my instinct screaming that I shouldn't ignore what I had just seen. Sarah disappearing with Zach and the others. Something was wrong. It wasn't just a surprise or party preparation. I knew it in my gut. The house felt unnaturally quiet on the second floor, the kind of silence that wraps itself around you like a warning. I reached the top of the stairs and noticed the light spilling from the half-open door of our bedroom. My heart hammered in my chest, and the uneasy feeling in my stomach turned to a knot of dread. I paused at the door, my hand trembling just inches from the knob. I couldn't shake the thoughts swirling in my head. Why had they gone upstairs? Why into our bedroom? And why did Sarah, my wife of 25 years, seem so at ease around that cocky kid Zach? The question burned in my mind, but I couldn't come up with a reasonable answer. All I knew was that something felt horribly off. I gripped the knob, trying to brace myself for whatever I was about to see. Then I slowly pushed the door open, praying that my worst fears weren't about to be confirmed. But as soon as I saw the scene inside, my world shattered. There, on the bed, our bed was Sarah. She wasn't just with Zach. They were together. The air left my lungs in a painful gasp as I took in the full horror of the scene. Mike and Tyler, Ben's other friends, stood near the bed, watching, like it was some sick spectacle for their entertainment. Their faces were flushed, grins plastered on their smug, youthful expressions. And Sarah, the woman I had built my life with, the mother of my son, was lost in whatever twisted moment this was. She wasn't the woman I thought I knew. She had become a stranger, and the laughter that came from her lips was foreign to me, vile. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was like my brain refused to process the betrayal that was unfolding in front of me. I wanted to believe I was dreaming, that this was some cruel hallucination brought on by stress or fatigue. But it wasn't a dream. "What the hell are you doing?" The words erupted from me before I even realized I had said them. My voice, thick with rage and disbelief, echoed through the room. It was like a bomb had gone off. The laughter stopped, the movement stilled, and suddenly, all eyes were on me. Sarah's smile disappeared in an instant, replaced by a look of shock and guilt. Zach pulled back, startled, his cocky grin fading as he realized he had been caught. Mike and Tyler stepped back from the bed, their smirks melting into expressions of discomfort and fear. The room was thick with silence, the weight of my fury pressing down on everyone. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst from my chest. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to tear the entire room apart. But all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the crushing weight of betrayal. The room was suffocating. The image of Sarah and Zach together in our bed was burned into my mind, and with it, the crushing weight of betrayal. My whole body trembled, fists clenched as the anger surged through me, overwhelming every other thought. I couldn't control it anymore. Without warning, I lunged at Zach. I didn't think, I just reacted, my fist swinging wildly. I caught him off guard, landing a punch square in his face. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock, and before he could react, I was on him again, fueled by all the rage and pain that had been building inside me. Suddenly, Mike and Tyler jumped in, grabbing at me, pulling me off Zach. But I kept swinging, trying to break free, determined to make him feel at least a fraction of the hurt that was tearing me apart. It was chaos. Fists flew, shouts filled the room, and the sound of bodies colliding echoed in my ears. Zach got back on his feet, joining the fight with his friends. It was 3 against 1 now, and though I fought with everything I had, I knew I was outmatched. The punches rained down on me from all sides, and soon I was overwhelmed. My body ached from the blows, and I could feel myself losing ground. But I wasn't the only one taking hits. Zach and his friends weren't coming out of this unscathed either. Eventually, they overpowered me, pinning me down as the adrenaline drained from my body, leaving behind only exhaustion and the bitter taste of defeat. I lay there on the floor, gasping for breath, my body bruised and battered, but it was the emotional pain that hurt the most. The room fell into silence, the chaos settling as quickly as it had erupted. Zach, Mike, and Tyler stood over me, bruised and panting, their faces no longer smug but tense, like they hadn't expected things to escalate this far. Sarah stood frozen at the edge of the room, her face pale, eyes wide with fear and regret. But I didn't want to look at her. I couldn't. The woman I had known for so long was now a stranger to me. Without a word, I pushed myself up, stumbling to my feet, my entire body throbbing. I didn't want to be here anymore. I couldn't bear to stay in that room, in that house. And so I turned and left, leaving behind the wreckage of the life I thought I knew. I staggered down the stairs, gripping the banister to steady myself, every inch of my body aching from the fight. The noise from the party seemed distant now, replaced by a hollow ringing in my ears. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the guests began to notice me, their laughter fading as they took in my torn clothes, bruised face, and bloodied hands. A hush fell over the room, and the air grew thick with confusion and shock. People whispered, their eyes darting between me and the stairs. I saw Ben in the crowd, frozen in place, staring at me with a look of pure devastation. My heart ached for him. He had no idea what had just happened upstairs, but he could tell something terrible had unfolded. Then Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs. She stood there, her face blank, cold, and detached, as if none of this was her problem. As if the chaos and destruction she had caused didn't concern her in the slightest. That look, that indifference, fueled the last bit of strength I had left. "Call the police," I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper at first, then louder. "Someone call the police." The guests stood still, unsure of what to do. They glanced at each other, then back at me, as if trying to make sense of the situation. No one moved. The disbelief was palpable. I could hear whispers spreading through the crowd, murmurings of confusion and concern. It felt like I was stuck in some nightmare, one where everything moved too slowly, and no one could hear me. "Call the damn police," I shouted, louder this time, my voice cracking with frustration and pain. That's when Sarah snapped. Her cold facade broke, and suddenly she was rushing down the stairs toward me, her face twisted with anger. "John, stop this," she hissed, grabbing my arm. "This is ridiculous. It was just a game. You're overreacting." A game? Was she seriously trying to pass this off as nothing? The fury inside me surged again, but I pulled my arm free from her grasp, glaring at her. "No, Sarah. This ends now," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside me. "I'm done with your lies. I'm done with you." Her eyes flared with rage, but I didn't care anymore. This wasn't something I could fix. The life we had built together, all the trust and love, it was all gone. She had destroyed everything. One of the guests finally pulled out their phone and dialed 911, their voice trembling as they explained what little they knew of the situation. In a matter of minutes, the police arrived. The sight of officers entering the house brought a new wave of whispers from the guests, who had now gathered in clusters, watching the unfolding disaster like spectators to a car crash. Sarah tried to reason with the officers, but it was no use. They separated us quickly, asking me what had happened. I told them everything, the fight, the betrayal, everything I had seen upstairs. My voice was shaking, my body still in pain, but I told them the truth. Zach and his friends were taken aside, their smugness completely gone now. They looked terrified, just boys who thought they could do anything and get away with it. But not today. As the officers placed handcuffs on Sarah, I caught a glimpse of her face. For the first time, I saw real panic. She looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You're going to regret this, John," she spat, but her voice lacked the same confidence. "You don't know what you're doing." I stared at her, numb. Maybe I didn't know everything. Maybe there was more beneath the surface. But I didn't care anymore. They led her out of the house, along with Zach, Mike, and Tyler. The guests slowly began to disperse, no one wanting to stay any longer in the aftermath of such a public scandal. But even as they left, I felt no relief. My world had crumbled, right here in front of everyone, and I had no idea how to begin picking up the pieces. The house was empty now, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I stood alone in the living room, staring blankly at the door where they had taken Sarah and those boys away. The police had left, the guests had scattered, and Ben had disappeared somewhere, too shocked to say a word to me. My entire life had collapsed in a matter of hours, and I wasn't sure what to do next. Every part of me hurt, physically and emotionally, but there was no way to mend the gaping hole that had been torn in my world. Sarah, my wife of 25 years, was gone. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to understand how it had come to this. I thought the worst had already happened, but the nightmare was far from over. The next morning, I woke up to a pounding knock at the door. My body still ached from the fight the night before, but I dragged myself up and made my way to the door, half expecting it to be the police with more questions, or maybe Ben returning home. But it wasn't. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a group of men, 6 of them. They were big, intimidating, and looked like the kind of people you wouldn't want to cross. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and a nasty scar running down the side of his face, stepped forward. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto mine, and a chill ran down my spine. "You John?" he asked, his voice gravelly, like he'd been smoking for decades. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain some sense of composure despite the growing fear in my gut. "Yeah, that's me. Who are you?" He didn't smile. Instead, his expression darkened, and he took a step closer, his presence almost suffocating. "You've got a problem, John," he said. "You pissed off the wrong people." Before I could respond, 2 of the other men flanked him, their arms crossed, their eyes locked on me like predators waiting for their prey to make a wrong move. The scar-faced man continued, his voice low and threatening. "Sarah," he spat the name out like it disgusted him, "she's got connections. People who don't like their business being messed with. You pressing charges? Filing for divorce? That's you messing with things you don't understand." My stomach sank as the realization hit me. Sarah wasn't just some woman who had betrayed me. There was more to her, something darker, something I hadn't known about all these years. She had ties to dangerous people, and now I had become their problem. "Listen," I began, my voice shaky. "I didn't know anything about her about this." The scarred man stepped even closer, his face inches from mine. "Doesn't matter," he growled. "What matters is you back off. You drop the charges, forget about the divorce, and keep your mouth shut. Or we'll be back. And next time you won't be walking away." I could feel the threat hanging in the air like a dark cloud, pressing down on me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I had no idea who these people were or what kind of mess Sarah had gotten us into. But I knew one thing. They were serious. And they wouldn't hesitate to hurt me, or worse. The man with the scar gave me one last cold stare before turning on his heel and walking away, his crew following closely behind. I stood there in the doorway, stunned, watching as they disappeared down the street, leaving me alone with the suffocating realization that this was far from over. I closed the door, my hands trembling. Sarah's betrayal was one thing, but this was something else entirely. I had no idea who she really was, what kind of life she had been leading behind my back. But now, her dangerous past had caught up to me, and I was trapped in it, whether I liked it or not. I needed help, and I needed to figure out exactly what I was up against. The moment the door slammed shut, I knew I couldn't waste any more time. The threats, the violence, it was only going to escalate. I didn't have the luxury of standing still or letting my emotions take over. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I grabbed my phone and dialed Roy Harris, a private investigator I had used once for a work-related issue. Roy wasn't the kind of guy to ask too many questions, and he worked fast. Right now, I didn't need sympathy. I needed someone who could dig into Sarah's past, find out what she'd been hiding all these years, and uncover who those men were. "Roy, it's John. I need you to start digging into my wife's past." "It's urgent," I said as soon as he answered. He didn't ask for details. "Give me a day," he replied before hanging up. A day felt like an eternity, but I had no choice. I spent the next 24 hours in a haze, pacing through the house, waiting for the phone to ring, my mind racing through the possibilities. Every hour that passed, the threats from the men at my door echoed louder in my head. Then, early the next morning, my phone buzzed. "John, you're not going to like this." Roy's voice was low, almost cautious. "Just tell me," I said, bracing myself. "She's got a history. A long one. Sarah wasn't just your average housewife. She's been involved with some serious people, money laundering, drugs, and God knows what else. These people she's tied to, they aren't playing games. She was connected to them before you even met her. Looks like she tried to clean up her act, but it didn't stick." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sarah, the woman I thought I knew, had been living a double life. All these years, she had managed to hide it from me. How? And why now, after all this time, had her past finally caught up with her? "There's more," Roy continued. I found out she's been moving your money, out of your joint accounts for months. And it's not just a small amount, John. She's cleaned you out." My stomach dropped. Everything, our life, our finances, she had taken it all. I had been blindsided by her lies, by the fake life we'd built. But that wasn't the worst part. She's been in contact with some of her old connections recently, Roy added, and she's planning something big. I've got a lead on where she's headed next. My heart pounded as Roy's words sunk in. Sarah wasn't just running away. She was gearing up for something bigger, something dangerous. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice steady but full of urgency. "She's meeting with some people on the outskirts of town. Some abandoned area." "I've got the location," Roy replied. "Meet me there," I said. "We need to move fast." Roy and I drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound cutting through the tension between us. The location he'd found, some abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, was the kind of place no one would go unless they had something to hide. The trees loomed over the narrow road, and the further we drove, the more isolated it became. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging through my veins. I had no idea what we were walking into, but there was no turning back now. "We'll get the evidence we need," Roy said, gripping his camera tightly as we approached the warehouse. "You stay back until I get the footage. If we have proof of her dealing or anything criminal, we can take it straight to the police." I nodded, but my mind wasn't fully there. All I could think about was Sarah, how this woman, who had shared my life for 25 years, had been leading a lie so deep, so dark, that I hadn't seen any of it. And now, she had dragged me into her nightmare. We parked the car a distance away and crept toward the warehouse. From where we hid, I could see the outlines of figures inside, the dim light spilling out from a cracked door. Roy motioned for me to stay put as he moved closer, positioning himself to get the evidence we needed. I watched through the gap in the door as Sarah stood in the center of the room, surrounded by 3 men. They were clearly not the kind of people you wanted to mess with. My heart raced as I saw her exchange something with one of them, money, drugs. I couldn't tell. But this was it. The proof. Roy signaled me that he had what we needed. He started to pull back when something caught my eye. Sarah was glancing around nervously, like she knew something was off. Before we could fully retreat, she turned and spotted us through the shadows. In a split second, she was charging toward the door, her eyes wild and filled with a desperate rage. She screamed my name, her voice echoing through the empty warehouse, full of fury and panic. "John, you bastard. You think you can just walk away from this?" Roy grabbed my arm. "We need to go now." We sprinted back toward the car, the sound of Sarah's footsteps behind us growing closer. I glanced back, seeing her chasing after us, her figure a twisted shadow in the night. Her once calm, manipulative exterior had shattered, revealing a woman completely unhinged by her own lies and desperation. We reached the car, Roy fumbling with the keys as we scrambled inside. Just as the engine roared to life, Sarah reached the window, pounding on it with her fists, her eyes wild. "You can't leave me, John," she shrieked. "You think this is over? You think you're safe? You don't know what you've done." Roy hit the gas, and the car lurched forward, leaving Sarah behind, her screams fading into the distance as we sped down the road. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rush of air outside the car as we drove away from the wreckage of my life. "We've got enough," Roy said finally, his voice steady. "She's done. The police will take it from here." I nodded, staring out the window, trying to process everything that had just happened. Sarah was gone in more ways than one. The woman I had known was a stranger, and her twisted web of lies had finally caught up with her. But even as we drove away, I knew this wasn't the end. The damage had been done. The life I had built was gone, and I had no idea how to move forward from here. The police acted quickly once we handed over the evidence. Roy's footage and the details he had uncovered were enough to charge Sarah with drug dealing and money laundering. They found her holed up in a seedy motel outside of town the next day. The news hit me hard, but in a way, I felt relieved. The nightmare was finally ending, or so I thought. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the phone after the detective called to confirm her arrest. The house felt unbearably empty, every corner reminding me of the life we had shared, the life that had been a lie. The silence weighed heavy, and I realized that even with Sarah gone, the echoes of her betrayal would linger for a long time. The legal process moved quickly. Sarah had no chance of escaping the charges, with the mountain of evidence stacked against her. The police were thorough, finding more drugs in her motel room, along with records of her illegal transactions. It was more than enough to ensure that she'd spend years behind bars. As for Zach and his friends, they weren't innocent either. The police charged them with contributing to the delinquency of an adult and issued hefty fines. But it was clear that Sarah had been the mastermind. The smug, cocky attitudes they had worn before were completely gone now, replaced by fear and shame. I didn't feel any satisfaction watching them squirm. In the end, they were just stupid kids who had gotten caught up in something far darker than they ever expected. But Sarah had destroyed everything. Weeks passed, and I tried to rebuild. Ben stayed away, living with a friend for the time being. He couldn't look at me, and I couldn't blame him. He was devastated not just by what had happened between Sarah and those boys, but by the fact that his mother had lived a secret life of crime, dragging our family into the mud. I spent many nights walking through the empty house, pacing from room to room, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. I thought back to the early days with Sarah, when things were simple, when we were happy. But now, I couldn't tell if any of it had ever been real. The woman I thought I loved had been hiding a dark side, one I had never seen. How could I have been so blind? The day the divorce was finalized was the first time I felt a sliver of closure. The paperwork was quick, a few signatures, and it was done. 25 years of marriage, reduced to a few pieces of paper. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, a strange lightness settled over me. The burden of her lies, the weight of everything that had happened, was still there, but it didn't suffocate me anymore. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. The house was still, the quiet not as heavy as it had been before. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Ben would ever fully heal from what his mother had done, or if I would ever trust anyone again. But sitting there, under the fading light of the day, I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, uncertain hope that maybe, just maybe, I could start to put the pieces of my life back together.